The dust had barely settled on Marcus Wheeler's grave when Evangeline Blackwood made an announcement that would echo through every saloon, general store, and cattle pen from Texas to Montana. Standing on the wraparound porch of the Blackwood estate, her black mourning dress stark against the whitewashed columns, she declared that any man who could pass her test would inherit not just her late husband's fortune, but her hand in marriage as well. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't tell them was that 12 men had already tried. What she didn't tell them was that 12 men were already dead. The Blackwood Ranch stretched across 47,000 acres of prime Texas grassland, where longhorn cattle grazed beneath an endless sky. Marcus Blackwood had built his empire from nothing, starting with a handful of cattle and ending with the largest spread west of the Mississippi. When consumption finally claimed him at 53, he left behind a fortune that made kings envious, and a 28-year-old widow who had married him for security, not love. Evangeline had been 17 when she first set foot on Blackwood soil, the daughter of a failed cotton farmer who saw marriage to Marcus as salvation for his family's debts. She had expected a life of quiet domesticity, managing household staff and hosting dinner parties for cattle barons and railroad men. What she discovered instead was a woman of fierce intelligence trapped in gilded circumstances, watching her husband's foreman manage the very business she understood better than any of them. 3 months after the funeral, when the lawyers had finished reading wills and the accounts had been settled, Evangeline found herself the sole owner of everything Marcus had built. The cattle, the land, the railroad contracts, the mining rights, the bank holdings in Dallas and San Antonio. Every rancher from the Rio Grande to Oklahoma Territory suddenly developed an urgent need to court the grieving widow. They came in waves, these suitors. Distinguished gentlemen in tailored suits who spoke of protecting her interests while eyeing her assets. Rough cowboys who figured a woman needed a strong hand to guide her. Young fortune hunters barely out of their teens who stammered through rehearsed proposals. Middle-aged businessmen who treated her like a business acquisition to be negotiated. Evangeline received them all with the same polite smile, the same gracious hospitality, and the same inevitable disappointment. None of them saw her as anything more than a beautiful obstacle standing between them and Marcus Blackwood's legacy. None of them bothered to ask what she wanted, what she thought, what she planned to do with the empire that was now rightfully hers. That's when she devised the test. The first man to take it was Harrison Caldwell, a neighboring rancher whose own spread had fallen on hard times. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in his finest clothes, bringing flowers and a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Evangeline listened to his proposal with apparent interest, nodding at appropriate moments, as he outlined how their combined properties would create an unstoppable cattle dynasty. "Your offer has merit, Harrison," she said when he finished. "But before I can consider marriage, I need to know that my husband can handle the challenges that come with this land. Marcus always said the ranch would test a man's character better than any church or courtroom." She led him to the stables, where a magnificent black stallion waited in the largest stall. Thunder was Marcus's pride, a horse that had never been fully broken, never fully trusted anyone except his original master. The animal stood 17 hands high, with eyes that held both intelligence and wildness. "If you can ride Thunder from here to the old oak at Miller's Creek and back, I'll know you're worthy of what Marcus built," Evangeline said. "The ranch hands will time you. 2 hours should be sufficient for a man who understands horses and land." Harrison studied the stallion with growing unease, but his desire for Evangeline's fortune outweighed his caution. He mounted Thunder with confidence, even as the horse danced sideways and rolled his eyes white. The moment Harrison settled into the saddle, Thunder exploded into motion, bucking and spinning with vicious intent. For 30 seconds, Harrison held on, Then Thunder launched into a series of twisting jumps that would have challenged a rodeo. Champion and Harrison sailed through the air, landing hard against the coral fence. The crack of his skull against the wooden post echoed across the courtyard. Like a gunshot, the ranch hands carried Harrison's body to the root cellar that same afternoon. Word of Harrison's death spread quickly, but Evangeline's version of events spread faster. A tragic accident, she told everyone who would listen. Harrison had insisted on riding the dangerous stallion despite her warnings. Such a shame that pride had led to such a terrible end. The second suitor arrived within the week. Bradley Morrison came from old money, his family's railroad interests stretching from New Orleans to Denver. He brought lawyers and accountants, treating the courtship like a business merger. Evangeline smiled through his presentations about portfolio diversification and asset management, then led him to the stables. Bradley laughed when he saw Thunder. "My dear Evangeline, I've been riding since I was 5 years old. My grandfather owned the finest thoroughbreds in Kentucky." Thunder killed Bradley before he made it out of the courtyard. This time, the horse reared up and came down with both front hooves, crushing the man's chest like an eggshell. The ranch hands buried Bradley next to Harrison, and Evangeline ordered a second cross for the small cemetery behind the BUNKHOUSE. By the time the fifth man died, a pattern had emerged that couldn't be ignored. The local sheriff, a man named Pete Garrison, who owed his position to Marcus Blackwood's political influence, paid Evangeline a visit on a sweltering Thursday afternoon. "Folks are starting to talk, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, accepting the glass of sweet tea she offered. "5 men dead in as many weeks. All trying to court you, all dying the same way." Evangeline's expression never changed. "Thunder was Marcus's horse, Sheriff. He warned me the animal was dangerous, but these men won't listen. They see a challenge and let their pride override their good sense." "Maybe it's time to put the horse down," Garrison suggested carefully. "That animal is worth more than most people make in 10 years, Evangeline replied. "Besides, I can't help it if men refuse to heed warnings about their own limitations." The sheriff left without pressing the issue further, but Evangeline knew she was walking a dangerous line. The deaths needed to seem accidental, tragic consequences of male pride and poor judgment. She couldn't afford to have anyone look too closely at the pattern. The 6th man lasted almost a minute on Thunder's back. The 7th made it halfway to the gate before the horse rolled over on him. The 8th, 9th, and 10th barely had time to settle into the saddle before Thunder sent them flying. After the 10th death, the suitors stopped coming for nearly a month. Evangeline began to think her message had been received, that the surviving fortune hunters had finally accepted the risks weren't worth the reward. She was almost disappointed. The game had become the most interesting part of her days, the only time she felt truly in control of her circumstances. Then Jeremiah Crawford arrived from Montana, bringing stories of his success in the copper mines and his reputation for breaking the wildest horses in the territory. He studied Thunder with the eye of a professional, noting the animal's conformation, the way he moved, the intelligence in his dark eyes. "This isn't about the horse, is it?" Jeremiah asked after watching Thunder pace his stall for several minutes. Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced since the test began, genuine surprise. "I'm not sure what you mean. A horse this magnificent, this well-trained, doesn't kill riders by accident. Someone's taught him to do exactly what he's doing." Jeremiah's gray eyes met hers directly. "Question is whether that someone was your late husband or you." For a moment, Evangeline considered calling off the test. Jeremiah had seen too much, understood too much. But she was committed to the game now, and curiosity about his next move outweighed caution. "Does it matter?" she asked. "Not particularly," Jeremiah said, swinging into Thunder's saddle with practiced ease. "Either way, I respect the craftsmanship." Thunder killed Jeremiah Crawford more efficiently than any of the others, crushing his windpipe with a precisely placed bite before the man could even attempt to ride. The ranch hands buried him that same evening, and Evangeline stood over his grave wondering if she had finally found a worthy opponent, even in death. The 12th man came in October, when the leaves on the oak trees had turned gold and the cattle were growing thick coats for winter. Thomas Brennan owned shipping interests in Galveston and spoke with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a challenge he couldn't buy his way through. Thunder trampled Thomas Brennan so thoroughly that the ranch hands needed 2 shovels to collect what remained. As winter settled over the Blackwood Ranch, Evangeline began to accept that no 13th man would come. Word had spread too far. The pattern had become too obvious. She would keep her fortune and her independence, but she would also keep the growing restlessness that had driven her to devise the test in the first place. That's when she saw the rider approaching through the morning mist, sitting straight in his saddle as his horse picked its way carefully along the frozen creek bed. Nathan Colt dismounted before he reached the main house, leading his sorrel mare by the reins as he approached the porch where Evangeline waited. His boots were worn, but well-maintained, his clothes practical rather than fancy. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years in the saddle, but there was something else in his bearing that set him apart from the 12 who had come before. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Nathan Colt. I believe we need to have a conversation." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Evangeline studied this unexpected visitor. He was younger than most of her previous suitors, perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and the kind of lean muscle that came from hard work rather than leisure. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held a directness that made her slightly uncomfortable. "If you're here to court me, Mr. Colt, I should warn you that I have very specific requirements for potential husbands." "I'm not here to court you," Nathan replied. "I'm here about the men who died trying." The words hung in the cold morning air like frost. Evangeline felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Thomas Brennan was my brother-in-law, married to my sister Sarah back in Galveston. She hired me to find out what really happened to him." Nathan's voice carried no accusation, just a statement of fact. "Took me 3 months to track down everyone who knew the 12 men who died. Here, took me another month to piece together the truth." Evangeline's mind raced through possibilities. She could deny everything, claim ignorance, express shock at his implications. She could have him removed from the property by her ranch hands. She could even suggest he take the same test that had claimed the others. Instead, she found herself asking, what truth would that be? That Thunder didn't kill those men by accident. That someone trained him to be a weapon, probably starting when he was just a colt. That you've been using him to eliminate suitors you found unsuitable. Nathan studied her face carefully. "The question is whether you're going to try to kill me too, or if you're curious enough about why I'm really here to let me live long enough to explain." The honesty of his words hit Evangeline like a physical blow. For months she had played elaborate games with men who saw only her beauty and her money. Here was someone who had seen through her carefully constructed facade and still stood calmly on her porch, apparently unafraid of the consequences. "Come inside," she said finally. "We'll discuss this properly." The Blackwood parlor reflected Marcus's taste for ostentation. Heavy furniture carved from imported mahogany, Persian rugs worth more than most families made in a year, oil paintings of pastoral scenes that had never existed on Texas rangeland. Evangeline poured coffee from a silver service while Nathan examined a photograph of her late husband. "Marcus Blackwood," Nathan said, setting down the frame. "Built this empire from nothing, they say. But that's not quite true, is it?" "Marcus was a remarkable man," Evangeline replied carefully. Marcus was a killer, Nathan said bluntly. Took me considerable digging to find the real story, but the pieces are all there if you know where to look. The homesteaders who mysteriously abandoned their claims. The ranchers who sold out after their cattle started dying of strange diseases. The water rights that changed hands after wells were poisoned. Evangeline set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. Those are serious accusations, Mr. Colt. They're facts. Marcus Blackwood murdered his way to this fortune, and you knew it. The question is whether you married him despite that knowledge or because of it. The silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. Evangeline had spent 11 years perfecting the role of the naive young wife who had married for security and found herself trapped by circumstances. Nathan Colt was the first person to see through that performance completely. Why does it matter? She asked finally. Because Thomas Brennan wasn't just my brother-in-law. He was also a Texas Ranger working undercover to investigate Marcus's business practices. Sarah knew he was getting close to something when he decided to court you. His death wasn't random bad luck. It was murder to cover up other murders. The revelation reframed everything Evangeline thought she knew about her 12th victim. Thomas Brennan hadn't been another greedy fortune hunter. He had been a lawman seeking justice for Marcus's crimes. You have no proof of any of this, she said. I have Thomas's notes, hidden in a safety deposit box in Galveston, along with witness statements and financial records. Enough evidence to hang Marcus Blackwood if he were still alive. Nathan's gray eyes never left her face. Enough evidence to hang you for continuing his work. What do you want? Justice for the men you killed. Justice for the people Marcus killed. And justice for my sister, who's been grieving a husband she thought died in a riding accident. Evangeline rose from her chair and walked to the window, overlooking the courtyard where Thunder paced restlessly in his paddock. The stallion was magnificent, a living weapon she had honed to perfection over years of careful training. Marcus had started the process, teaching the horse to respond to subtle commands to attack on cue. After Marcus's death, Evangeline had refined those lessons, turning Thunder into an instrument of precise lethality. What kind of justice, she asked. The kind that comes from a federal judge and jury. I'm prepared to testify about everything I've discovered. Sarah deserves to know the truth about how her husband died. And if I refuse, then I'll arrest you myself. I'm still a deputy marshal, Mrs. Blackwood. Have been for 8 years. Evangeline turned from the window, studying Nathan with new interest. You're not here as Thomas's brother-in-law. You're here as a lawman. Both. Sometimes personal justice and legal justice point in the same direction, but not always. Nathan's expression softened slightly. No, not always. I could have you killed, Evangeline said conversationally. My ranch hands are loyal to me, not to the law. Your body could disappear into the prairie, and no one would ever find it. You could try. But I sent detailed reports to the marshal's office in Austin before I rode out here. If I don't return by the end of the week, they'll send a full company of rangers to investigate. Evangeline smiled for the first time since Nathan had arrived. You're smarter than the others. The others weren't trying to arrest you. They were trying to marry you. And what are you trying to do, Marshal Colt? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had expected when the conversation began. Nathan had come, seeking justice for his sister and the men Evangeline had killed. But sitting in her parlor, watching her move with predatory grace, listening to her speak with deadly honesty, he found himself confronting a woman far more complex than the simple murderer he had expected to find. I'm trying to understand you, he said finally. Why? Because killing you won't bring back the dead, and arresting you won't change what Marcus built this empire on. But maybe understanding why you did what you did will help me figure out what justice actually looks like. Evangeline returned to her chair, studying Nathan with the same intensity he directed at her. What do you want to understand? Why do you stay? Why did you continue Marcus's work after he died? Why did you turn yourself into something you weren't? When you married him, what makes you think I turned into something different? What makes you think I wasn't exactly this when I walked down the aisle at 17? The question stopped Nathan cold. He had assumed Evangeline's transformation from innocent bride to calculating killer, but what if that assumption was wrong? What if she had always possessed the capacity for violence, and marriage to Marcus had simply given her the opportunity to exercise it? Were you? He asked. My father sold me to Marcus to pay his debts. 300 head of cattle and a section of bottom land in exchange for his daughter. Marcus knew exactly what he was getting, a young woman desperate enough to do anything. To survive. Evangeline's voice carried no self-pity, just statement of fact. The question isn't why I became what I am. The question is what you're going to do about it. Nathan found himself in uncharted territory. He had come to arrest a murderer and found instead a woman who had been shaped by circumstances beyond her control, who had adapted to survive in a world that offered her no alternatives. Justice demanded that she pay for her crimes, but justice was more complicated than he had anticipated. Tell me about the test, he said. Tell me how it really worked. Which part? The careful training of a dangerous animal? The selection of men whose deaths would cause minimal investigation? The performance of grief and shock that convinced everyone these were tragic accidents? All of it. Evangeline settled back in her chair, and for the next hour, she dissected her methodology with clinical precision. She explained how Marcus had begun Thunder's training, teaching the stallion to respond to whistle commands, to attack on cue, to make kills look accidental. She described her own refinements to the process, how she had studied each potential victim to ensure their deaths would generate sympathy rather than suspicion. The key was understanding what each man wanted, she said. Harrison Caldwell wanted to prove his courage. Bradley Morrison wanted to demonstrate his superiority. They all had something to prove, and that made them vulnerable. What about Thomas? What did he want to prove? Thomas was different. He was patient, methodical. He asked questions the others didn't ask. I realized he was dangerous, but by then, I was committed to the pattern. Breaking it would have raised more suspicion than maintaining it. Nathan absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the woman sitting across from him with the calculated killer she described. Evangeline Blackwood was intelligent, ruthless, and completely honest about her actions. She felt no remorse for the deaths she had caused, but she also took no pleasure in them. They had been necessary steps in maintaining her freedom and security. What happens now? She asked when she finished her confession. That depends on you. How so? I came here to arrest you. But arresting you won't solve the larger problem. Marcus built this empire on blood, and that blood is still soaked into every acre of this ranch. Taking you away in chains won't change that. What would change it? Nathan stood and walked to the window where Thunder continued his restless pacing. The stallion was beautiful and deadly, a perfect metaphor for the woman who controlled him. Justice isn't always about punishment, he said finally. Sometimes it's about making things right. And how do you propose to make this right? By giving you a choice. Come with me willingly. Testify about Marcus's crimes. Help me build cases against the men who helped him. Use what you know to bring real justice to the people he wronged. In exchange for what? A chance at redemption. A chance to turn what you've learned into something better than revenge. Evangeline joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. And if I refuse? Then I arrest you here and now, and you face trial for 12 counts of murder. No deals, no cooperation. No chance at anything but a rope around your neck. They stood in silence, watching Thunder move with deadly grace through the fading afternoon light. The choice Nathan offered was more complex than simple arrest, and they both knew it. He was asking her to transform herself once again, to become something neither of them could fully envision. "There's a third option," Evangeline said quietly. "Which is, you could stay. Help me run this ranch the right way. Use Marcus's fortune to undo the damage he caused." She turned to face him directly. "Make me your partner instead of your prisoner." Nathan felt the pull of her suggestion, the dangerous appeal of a woman who understood power and wasn't afraid to wield it. But he also understood the trap she was offering, the seductive promise of sharing her world instead of dismantling it. "That's not justice," he said. "That's compromise. With evil, is it? Or is it the beginning of something better?" The question would haunt Nathan for the rest of his life, but in that moment, standing in the dying light of a Texas afternoon, he made his choice. Nathan's choice came in the form of steel handcuffs. That clicked around Evangeline's wrists like the closing of a book. She didn't resist, didn't plead, didn't even seem surprised. She simply extended her hands and watched him secure the restraints with the same detached interest she had shown while describing her victims' deaths. "You realize this won't end the way you think it will," she said as he led her toward the door. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've spent the last 2 hours trying to understand me instead of simply arresting me. That means you're not the same man who rode onto this ranch this morning." Nathan paused at the threshold, his hand on the brass doorknob that Marcus Blackwood had imported from Philadelphia. Evangeline was right, though he wasn't ready to admit it. The woman he was arresting bore little resemblance to the cold-blooded killer he had expected to find, and the justice he sought felt more complicated than it had seemed from a distance. "Understanding doesn't change what you did," he said. "No, but it changes what you're going to do about it." They emerged onto the porch where Nathan's horse waited patiently beside Evangeline's own mare, a chestnut Arabian that Marcus had given her as a wedding gift. The ranch hands had gathered in the courtyard, drawn by the unusual sight of their mistress in restraints. Their faces showed confusion rather than alarm, unsure whether they should intervene or simply watch. "Mrs. Blackwood?" called Jake Morrison, the head foreman who had worked for Marcus since the early days. "You want us to do something about this?" Evangeline surveyed the men who had served her faithfully, who had buried 12 bodies without asking questions, who had maintained their silence about the true nature of Thunder's training. With a single word, she could turn them against Nathan, could disappear his body into the vast expanse of Texas grassland, just as she had threatened. "Stand down, Jake. Marshal Colt is doing his job." The dismissal rippled through the assembled, hands like wind through wheat. They began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, casting backward glances at the woman who had commanded their loyalty through a careful balance of authority and generosity. Nathan helped Evangeline mount her horse, adjusting the reins so she could manage despite the handcuffs. As they prepared to ride toward Austin, Thunder appeared at the fence of his paddock, snorting and pawing the ground with obvious agitation. "What about him?" Nathan asked, nodding toward the stallion. "What about him? He's evidence. Proof of how the murders were committed." Evangeline turned in her saddle to study the magnificent animal that had been both her weapon and her salvation. Thunder represented years of patient training, careful conditioning, the transformation of natural aggression into controlled lethality. He was also, she realized, the last living connection to the life she was leaving behind. Thunder is just a horse marshal. Dangerous, yes, but not guilty of any crime. He did what he was trained to do, nothing more. Someone needs to take responsibility. For him, Jake will see that he's properly cared for. The ranch isn't going anywhere, and neither is Thunder. They rode east through the afternoon, following cattle trails that would eventually connect to the main road leading to Austin. The landscape rolled past them in waves of brown grass, punctuated by stands of oak and mesquite, a vast canvas painted in shades of gold and shadow. For the first hour, they traveled in silence. Nathan found himself studying his prisoner, noting how she sat her horse with unconscious grace, how her eyes constantly surveyed the horizon with the alertness of someone who had learned to watch for danger. She bore no resemblance to the grieving widow who had received suitors in her parlor, nor to the calculating killer who had described her methods with clinical precision. "Tell me about Sarah," Evangeline said suddenly. The request caught Nathan off guard. "What do you want to know? What she was like? What kind of woman Thomas Brennan married? What kind of sister mourns her husband by hiring someone to investigate his death?" Nathan considered the question, searching for words that would capture his sister's essence. Sarah was 3 years younger than him, possessed of the same stubborn determination that had driven Nathan into law enforcement, but tempered with a gentleness he had never managed to cultivate. "Sarah believes in justice," he said finally. "Not the kind that comes from courtrooms and judges, but the kind that comes from knowing the truth about the people you love. She sounds naive. She sounds like someone who's never had to compromise her principles to survive." The observation struck home with unexpected force. Evangeline had spent her entire adult life making compromises, adapting her morality to match her circumstances, transforming herself to meet the demands of each new situation. The idea of maintaining consistent principles, of refusing to bend in the face of necessity, seemed as foreign as speaking a language she had never learned. "What will you tell her about how Thomas died? The truth? That he was murdered by a woman who saw him as a threat to her freedom. And what will she do with that truth?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. Sarah had loved her husband with the kind of pure devotion that had never been tested by betrayal or disillusionment. Learning that Thomas had died not as a victim of accident, but as a casualty of justice would devastate her in ways Nathan wasn't sure she could survive. "She grieve," he said eventually. "But she also know that his death meant something, that he died pursuing justice rather than chasing fortune. Will that comfort her? I don't know." They made camp that evening beside a creek that wound through a grove of cottonwoods. Nathan secured Evangeline's handcuffs to a sturdy branch, positioned so she could sit comfortably, but couldn't escape. He built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of hardtack and beans, actions performed with the automatic efficiency of someone who had spent years living rough as darkness settled around them. Evangeline broke the silence that had persisted since they dismounted. "You could let me go." Nathan looked up from the fire, studying her face in the flickering light. "Why would I do that?" "Because arresting me won't accomplish what you really want. It won't bring Thomas back. It won't give Sarah the closure she needs. It won't undo any of the damage Marcus caused. It will see justice done. Will it? Or will it just create another victim?" Nathan poked at the fire with a charred stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. "You're not a victim, Evangeline. You're a killer who chose to continue killing, even after the man who corrupted you was dead. I chose to survive. In a world that gave me no other options, I chose to survive. There are always other options. Are there? What would you have done in my place? Married at 17 to a man who murdered his way to wealth, surrounded by people who saw me as property to be inherited, with no money of my own and no skills beyond those required to manage a household." Evangeline's voice carried no self-pity, just a recitation of facts. What options did I have that didn't involve accepting someone else's control over my life? The question hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. Nathan wanted to argue, to insist that she could have found another way, but the conviction felt hollow even as he formed the words. Evangeline had been trapped by circumstances largely beyond her control, and her response to that trap had been both logical and ruthless. "You could have left after Marcus died. Sold the ranch, taken the money, started over somewhere else. With what identity? What skills? What protection from the men who would have seen me as prey the moment I left Texas?" Evangeline shifted against the tree, the handcuffs clicking softly against bark. I was 17 when I married Marcus, 39 when he died. I spent 22 years learning to be his wife, his possession, his carefully controlled asset. What exactly was I supposed to transform myself into? Someone better than what you became. I became someone who survived. Someone who took control of her own fate, instead of accepting whatever fate others chose for her. Nathan fed another branch to the fire, watching flames consume the dry wood with hungry efficiency. Evangeline's argument possessed a terrible logic that he couldn't entirely dismiss. She had been shaped by forces beyond her control, had adapted to circumstances that would have destroyed someone weaker. The men you killed were innocent, were they? Harrison Caldwell beat his wife so badly she couldn't leave the house for weeks at a time. Bradley Morrison made his fortune shipping Confederate supplies during the war, extending the conflict by months. Jeremiah Crawford's copper mines used slave labor long after abolition. Evangeline's voice remained steady, matter of fact. I didn't choose my victims randomly, Marshall. I chose men whose deaths would make the world a marginally better place. The revelation shook Nathan more than he cared to admit. He had assumed Evangeline's victims were innocent fortune hunters, men guilty of nothing more than greed and poor judgment. Learning that she had selected targets based on their past crimes complicated his understanding of her actions in ways he wasn't prepared to address. That doesn't give you the right to execute them. No, but it means their death served a purpose beyond my own survival. Nathan stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of their small camp where the darkness pressed against the circle of firelight. Evangeline watched him with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for others to work through their moral struggles. "What about Thomas?" he asked finally. "What crimes did he commit that justified his death?" "Thomas was hunting me. His crime was being too good at his job, too persistent in his investigation. He would have exposed not just my actions, but Marcus's as well, and that exposure would have destroyed innocent people." "What innocent people?" "The ranch hands who buried bodies without asking questions. The townspeople who accepted Marcus's charity without examining its source. The families who depended on the ranch for their livelihood." Evangeline's voice carried no defensiveness, just explanation. "Justice isn't always clean, Marshall. Sometimes protecting some innocent people requires sacrificing others." Nathan returned to the fire, settling cross-legged on his bedroll. The conversation had veered far from his original intentions, transforming from interrogation into something approaching philosophical debate. "You're asking me to believe that murder can be moral. I'm asking you to recognize that morality is more complex than the law admits. You've been a lawman for 8 years. Haven't you ever encountered situations where following the letter of the law would have caused more harm than breaking it?" The question struck uncomfortably close to home. Nathan had indeed faced moments where strict adherence to legal procedure would have resulted in tragedies that flexible interpretation could prevent. He had bent rules, ignored technicalities, exercised discretion in ways that weren't strictly legal but felt morally necessary. "That's different, is it? Or is it just a matter of degree?" They sat in silence while the fire burned lower, each lost in thoughts too complex for easy resolution. Nathan had expected this journey to be straightforward. Arrest the killer, transport her to trial, see justice done. Instead, he found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about right and wrong, justice and survival, the nature of moral choice in an amoral world. "Tell me about the first one," he said eventually. "Tell me about Harrison Caldwell." Evangeline settled back against the tree, her expression thoughtful. "Harrison was different from the others. When he came to court me, I actually considered accepting his proposal." "What changed your mind?" "I visited his ranch while he was in town on business. Spoke with his wife, Elena. She was 23 years old and looked 40. Covered in bruises she tried to hide with powder and long sleeves." Evangeline's voice grew quiet, contemplative. "She begged me not to marry him, said she couldn't. Bear the thought of another woman suffering what she had endured. So you killed him. So I saved her. Alina Caldwell inherited her husband's ranch and used the money to start a school for girls whose families couldn't afford education. She's remarried now to a man who treats her with respect and kindness. Nathan absorbed this information, adding it to his growing understanding of Evangeline's complex motivations. Each revelation deepened the moral ambiguity of her actions, making simple condemnation increasingly difficult. What about the others? Did they all have similar crimes? Some. Others were guilty of different sins: corruption, cruelty, exploitation. I spent months researching each potential suitor before allowing them to court me. Evangeline smiled grimly. It's remarkable how much you can learn about a man if you know where to look and have the resources to pay for information. You turned courtship into an execution process. I turned courtship into a selection process. The good men never got close enough to take the test. Nathan felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. You screened them beforehand. Made sure only the corrupt ones made it to the final stage. I made sure only the dangerous ones got close enough to be dangerous to me. The distinction felt crucial, though Nathan couldn't articulate exactly why. Evangeline hadn't been randomly killing suitors. She had been eliminating specific threats while simultaneously ridding the world of men who had caused suffering to others. That still doesn't justify murder. No, but it explains it. And sometimes explanation is more important than justification. Nathan banked the fire for the night, ensuring enough coals remained to provide warmth until dawn. As he settled into his bedroll, he became aware that the fundamental nature of his mission had changed. He was no longer simply transporting a prisoner to trial. He was escorting a woman whose actions had been both monstrous and comprehensible, both criminal and necessary. "Get some sleep," he said. "We have a long ride tomorrow." "Marshal?" "Yes? Thank you for listening." Nathan didn't respond, but as he drifted towards sleep, he found himself wondering whether understanding Evangeline Blackwood had been a mistake. That would haunt him for the rest of his life, or the beginning of wisdom he had never possessed before dawn brought complications that Nathan hadn't anticipated. As he prepared to break camp, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the prairie like distant thunder. 5 riders emerged from the morning mist, their faces grim beneath the brims of weathered hats. Nathan recognized Jake Morrison in the lead, flanked by 4 of the Blackwood Ranch's most experienced hands. "Morning, Marshal," Jake called out, reining his horse to a stop 20 yards from the camp. "We've come to escort Mrs. Blackwood back home." Nathan's hand drifted instinctively toward his sidearm, though he kept his movements casual. 5 against 1 represented poor odds, especially with Evangeline's safety to consider. The ranch hands weren't outlaws, but their loyalty to their employer ran deeper than their respect for federal law. "Mrs. Blackwood is under arrest for murder, Jake. She's coming with me to Austin." "That's not going to happen," Jake replied with the quiet certainty of a man who had made peace with difficult decisions. "Mrs. Blackwood has been good to us, treated us fair, paid us well. We're not about to let her be railroaded by accusations we know aren't true." Evangeline, still secured to the cottonwood tree, watched the confrontation with keen interest. A single word from her could escalate the situation into violence, could transform her rescue into a bloodbath that would solve nothing and endanger everyone involved. "Stand down, Jake," she said firmly. "I appreciate your loyalty, but Marshal Colt is operating within his authority. Mrs. Blackwood, with respect, you don't understand what's going to happen to you in Austin. Federal judges don't take kindly to women who step outside their place, regardless of the evidence. The evidence will speak for itself." Jake's weathered face creased with frustration. "The evidence will hang you, ma'am. These 12 men died on your property, and that's all a jury's going to care about." Nathan found himself in the unexpected position of agreeing with the ranch foreman. Federal courts in 1887 weren't known for their sympathy toward women who challenged traditional roles, regardless of the circumstances that had driven them to violence. Evangeline would face a legal system designed and operated by men who viewed female independence as inherently suspicious. "Jake's right," Nathan said quietly. "The trial won't be fair." Evangeline turned to study him with surprise. "Then why are you taking me there?" "Because it's the law." "The law isn't always just." Nathan had spent 8 years enforcing federal statutes, pursuing fugitives, maintaining order in territories where civilization existed only through the barrel of a gun. He believed in the law because he had seen what happened in its absence, had witnessed the chaos that consumed communities when justice became a matter of personal opinion rather than established procedure. But Evangeline Blackwood challenged every assumption he had made about the relationship between law and justice. Her crimes were undeniable, but her circumstances were exceptional. Her methods were brutal, but her targets had been corrupt. Her actions were illegal, but their results had arguably made the world safer. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting that sometimes justice requires creativity." Jake Morrison shifted in his saddle, hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "Mrs. Blackwood, we can have you back at the ranch by noon. Marshall Colt can ride out of Texas and forget he ever heard of the Blackwood spread." "And then what?" Evangeline asked. "More suitors would come eventually. More men would die. The cycle would continue until someone less sympathetic than Marshall Colt came to investigate." Nathan understood that Evangeline was offering him an escape from the moral complexity she represented. He could accept Jake's implicit threat, retreat to safer territory, file a report claiming insufficient evidence. The easy path lay open before him, requiring only that he abandon his principles and ignore his duty. "There's another option," Nathan said slowly, the words forming even as he spoke them, "which is, you cooperate fully with my investigation into Marcus's crimes. Help me build cases against his surviving associates. Use your knowledge to seek justice for his victims." Nathan paused, considering the implications of what he was about to propose. "In exchange, I recommend clemency based on the extenuating circumstances of your situation." Jake Morrison's expression hardened. "That's still a hanging offense, Marshall. Clemency doesn't mean acquittal." "No, but it means a chance. And it means the information Marcus tried to hide dies with him instead of being buried along with Evangeline." The proposal hung in the morning air like gunsmoke after a battle. Evangeline studied Nathan's face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, she saw a man wrestling with competing loyalties, trying to balance legal obligation against moral complexity. "What kind of cooperation?" she asked. "Complete disclosure. Names, dates, methods, financial records. Everything you know about Marcus's criminal activities and everyone who helped him commit them. Some of those people are still alive, still powerful. Exposing them would be dangerous. More dangerous than facing a murder trial." Evangeline considered the question seriously. Marcus's criminal network had included judges, politicians, railroad executives, men whose wealth and influence dwarfed even the Blackwood fortune. Testifying against them would require courage that bordered on suicide, but it would also offer the possibility of meaningful justice for his victims. "If I cooperate, what guarantee do I have that you'll honor your recommendation for clemency?" "My word. The word of a man I met yesterday. The word of a man who could have shot you on sight and claimed you resisted arrest." The logic was unassailable. Nathan held all the advantages in their current situation, yet he was offering negotiation instead of demanding surrender. His proposal represented risk for both of them, but it also offered the possibility of a resolution that served justice better than simple punishment. "I'll need certain assurances," Evangeline said finally. "Such as?" "Protection for my ranch hands. Whatever crimes I committed, They were following orders from someone they trusted. Jake and his men shouldn't pay for my decisions. Nathan nodded. Agreed. Financial security for the families of Marcus's victims. The ranch can afford to provide compensation for the suffering he caused. That would be up to a judge to decide, but I'll support the recommendation. And Thunder? Nathan looked puzzled. What about him? He's evidence, as you said. But he's also a living creature who was trained to kill through no fault of his own. I want assurance that he'll be cared for, not destroyed because of what humans taught him to do. The request revealed something in Evangeline that Nathan hadn't expected to find. Despite her calculated ruthlessness, despite her willingness to use the stallion as a weapon, she genuinely cared about the animal's welfare. It was a small crack in her armor of emotional detachment, but it suggested depths of feeling she had, kept carefully hidden. Thunder will be relocated to a place where he can live out his days safely. Nathan promised. Jake Morrison had listened to this negotiation with growing understanding. His loyalty to Evangeline was absolute, but he recognized that Nathan's proposal offered her the best chance of survival, while also serving the broader cause of justice. Mrs. Blackwood, Jake said quietly, this might be the only way forward that doesn't end with you dead. Evangeline closed her eyes, weighing options that all carried substantial risk. Cooperation would require her to betray people who had trusted her, to expose secrets that could destroy powerful men, to transform herself once again into something she had never been. But it would also offer the possibility of redemption, of using her knowledge to serve justice rather than subvert it. There's something else you should know, she said, opening her eyes to meet Nathan's gaze directly. About why Thomas Brennan was really here. Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do you mean? Thomas wasn't just investigating Marcus's past crimes. He was investigating ongoing criminal activities. Marcus died 3 months ago, but his network continued operating without him. Operating how? Cattle rustling, land fraud, murder for hire. Everything. Marcus Built didn't die with him, it just found new leadership. The implications hit Nathan like a physical blow. He had assumed that Marcus Blackwood's death had ended his criminal enterprise, that Evangeline's victims had been seeking to inherit a legitimate fortune. Instead, she was describing an ongoing conspiracy that stretched far beyond a single ranch. In Texas, who's running it now? Judge William Hartley in Austin, Sheriff Pete Garrison in the county seat, Railroad Executive Charles Pemberton in Dallas. They were Marcus's partners, and they've been dividing his territory among themselves since the funeral. Nathan felt the investigation expanding beyond anything he had imagined. What had begun as a simple arrest for multiple homicides was becoming something much larger, much more dangerous. That's why you killed Thomas specifically, he said, understanding finally clicking into place. Not because he was investigating you, but because he was getting close to exposing the entire network. Thomas's investigation would have destroyed the lives of hundreds of innocent people whose only crime was working for the wrong man. It would also have allowed Marcus's real partners to escape justice by blaming everything on a dead man. So you eliminated the threat. I eliminated the investigator before he could expose people who didn't deserve to be exposed, while preserving evidence that could be used against people who did deserve justice. Nathan stared at her in amazement. You've been protecting Thomas's investigation while pretending to obstruct it. I've been waiting for someone smart enough to use that investigation properly. Someone who understood the difference between punishment and justice. The conversation had reached a turning point that neither of them had anticipated. Nathan realized that Evangeline had been testing him just as surely as she had tested her 12 victims, evaluating his character, his intelligence, his commitment to justice beyond mere law enforcement. The evidence Thomas gathered, Nathan said. Where is it? Safe, hidden where only I can retrieve it. And you're willing to turn it over? To the right person, pursuing justice for the right reasons. Nathan looked around the small camp where 5 armed men waited for his decision, where a woman in handcuffs held information that could bring down a criminal conspiracy spanning 3 states. The choice he made in the next few minutes would determine not just Evangeline's fate, but the fate of everyone touched by Marcus Blackwood's legacy. "Jake," he said finally, "take your men back to the ranch." "Marshal, I can't. Mrs. Blackwood and I have business to discuss that doesn't concern you." "She'll be safe, but this conversation needs to happen without an audience." Jake Morrison studied Nathan's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll be at Miller's Creek if you need us, Mrs. Blackwood." As the ranch hands rode away, Nathan turned back to Evangeline with a question that would reshape everything he thought he knew about justice, law, and the space between them. "Tell me where Thomas hid his evidence," he said, "and then tell me exactly what you propose we do with it." Evangeline directed Nathan to a section of creek bank where ancient oaks created a natural cathedral of twisted branches and filtered sunlight. Beneath the largest tree, she indicated a specific arrangement of stones that appeared random to the casual observer, but formed a deliberate pattern for those who knew how to read it. "Thomas was more clever than I gave him credit for," she said as Nathan began moving rocks according to her instructions. He suspected that any evidence hidden in town could be compromised by Marcus's associates, so he chose a location that only someone intimately familiar with the ranch would know. Nathan's fingers found the edge of an oiled canvas wrapped around a metal box. Inside, Thomas Brennan's careful documentation told a story that exceeded even Evangeline's dark revelations. Shipping manifests showing cattle stolen from small ranchers and sold through legitimate channels. Bank records documenting bribes paid to judges and politicians. Correspondence between Marcus and his associates, planning the elimination of competitors. "Sweet Jesus," Nathan breathed, scanning page after page of meticulous evidence. Thomas documented everything. He was building a case that would have brought down the entire network. Judges, sheriffs, railroad executives, cattle barons from Texas to Kansas. Evangeline watched Nathan's expression change as he grasped the scope of the conspiracy. His death saved their lives and destroyed his sister's husband. Nathan found himself holding documentation of crimes that dwarfed anything he had investigated during his years as a marshal. Marcus Blackwood hadn't simply murdered his way to wealth. He had constructed a criminal empire that corrupted institutions across the frontier. The evidence Thomas had gathered could topple governments, destroy fortunes, reshape the balance of power throughout the Southwest. "Why didn't you use this before?" Nathan asked. "You could have exposed them years ago. With what authority? What is standing? Who would have believed the accusations of a ranch owner's wife against some of the most powerful men in Texas?" Evangeline's voice carried bitter knowledge. "Women don't get to seek justice, Marshal. We get to survive it." Nathan studied a letter written in Marcus's hand, detailing payments to Judge William Hartley for favorable rulings in land disputes. The casual nature of the corruption, the matter-of-fact way Marcus discussed purchasing legal decisions, spoke to a system so thoroughly compromised that individual resistance seemed futile. Thomas planned to take this to the federal prosecutor in Washington, Evangeline continued. Someone outside the local network of corruption. But that would have taken months to arrange, and in the meantime, innocent people would have suffered, while guilty ones escaped. "So you eliminated the threat to buy time." "I eliminated the immediate threat while preserving the long-term solution." Nathan carefully rewrapped the evidence, his mind working through implications that stretched far beyond a simple murder case. The documents Thomas had gathered represented the key to dismantling a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades. But using that evidence would require navigating political complexities that could prove as dangerous as any gunfight. "Judge Hartley oversees the federal court in Austin," Nathan said thoughtfully. "If he's corrupt, presenting this evidence there would be suicide." Precisely why Thomas was planning to bypass local jurisdiction entirely. "But I don't have his connections in Washington." I'm just a deputy marshal from a small territory. Evangeline smiled for the first time since their journey began, an expression that transformed her face from beautiful to radiant. No, but I do. Nathan looked up sharply. What do you mean? Marcus wasn't the only one who cultivated relationships with powerful people. I spent 11 years attending dinners, charity events, political gatherings. I know which senators can be trusted, which judges have clean reputations, which prosecutors have both the authority and the integrity to handle evidence like this. The revelation opened possibilities that Nathan hadn't considered. Evangeline's social connections, formed during years of playing the dutiful wife, could provide access to levels of power that would be impossible for a frontier lawman to reach. You're talking about a federal conspiracy case involving some of the most influential men in Texas. I'm talking about justice for hundreds of victims whose suffering was ignored because their killers had money and political connections. Nathan stood, pacing to the creek's edge where clear water flowed over smooth stones worn by centuries of current. The decision before him would determine not just Evangeline's fate, but the fate of everyone touched by Marcus Blackwood's criminal enterprise. Following proper procedure meant delivering her to a corrupt court system that would likely execute her while allowing the real criminals to escape. Accepting her proposal meant abandoning his role as law enforcement officer and becoming something closer to a vigilante. What exactly are you proposing? A partnership. You provide the legal authority and law enforcement expertise. I provide the evidence, the connections, and the insider knowledge necessary to build unbreakable cases. Partners in what? In bringing down the network that Marcus built. In seeking justice for his victims. In ensuring that his legacy becomes exposure and punishment rather than continued corruption. Nathan turned back toward the camp where Evangeline sat against the oak tree, handcuffs glinting in the morning sunlight. The woman who had killed 12 men was offering to help him achieve justice on a scale he had never imagined possible. If we do this, you'll be testifying against some of the most powerful men in the Southwest. They won't hesitate to kill you to protect themselves. They'll try to kill me anyway once they realize what Thomas discovered. At least this way my death might serve a purpose. The pragmatism of her response struck Nathan as both admirable and deeply sad. Evangeline had accepted that her life was forfeit regardless of the choices she made, but she was determined to make her death count for something meaningful. There's another problem, Nathan said. Even if we succeed in exposing the network, you're still guilty of 12 murders. Federal prosecutors don't ignore multiple homicides, regardless of the circumstances. Then we make sure the circumstances become part of the public record. How? Evangeline shifted against the tree, testing the strength of her restraints. By ensuring that my trial becomes the venue for exposing everything Marcus did, everything his partners are still doing. By making my defense inseparable from the larger case against corruption. Nathan began to understand the strategic brilliance of her proposal. A public trial would force the exposure of evidence that powerful men would prefer to keep hidden. Evangeline's defense would become a weapon against the very network that had created the circumstances leading to her crimes. You're talking about using your own trial to destroy the people who corrupted you. I'm talking about ensuring that my death serves justice instead of protecting injustice. Nathan removed the handcuffs, watching as Evangeline rubbed circulation back into her wrists. The gesture represented more than simple physical relief. It symbolized a fundamental shift in their relationship from captor and prisoner to partners, in a cause neither had fully understood when their journey began. If we do this, there's no going back, Nathan warned. Once we start down this path, we'll have enemies who won't stop until we're both dead. I've had enemies since the day I married Marcus. The difference is that now I might have an ally. Nathan extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Evangeline shook it. The agreement they made beside the creek would bind them together in a cause that transcended law enforcement, personal justice, or romantic attraction. They were committing themselves to a war against corruption that could destroy them both. Where do we start? Nathan asked. With Charles Pemberton in Dallas. He's the most vulnerable of Marcus's partners, the most likely to break under pressure. If we can turn him against the others, we can build cases that will stand up in any court. What makes him vulnerable? Charles has a daughter, Rebecca Pemberton, 22 years old, recently engaged to the son of a federal judge in Colorado. Charles would do anything to protect her reputation, her future, her happiness. Nathan felt a familiar chill. You're talking about using his daughter as leverage. I'm talking about offering him a choice between protecting his criminal associates and protecting his family. Most fathers choose family when forced to decide. And if he doesn't, then we present the evidence without his cooperation and let him face the consequences alongside the others. Nathan studied the woman who had just become his partner in a cause he barely understood. Evangeline Blackwood was offering him the chance to pursue justice on a scale that could reshape criminal law enforcement across the frontier. But she was also asking him to compromise his principles, to use tactics that blurred the line between law enforcement and manipulation. This isn't how marshals usually operate, he said. This isn't a usual case. Nathan gathered Thomas's evidence, carefully securing the documents in his saddlebags. The weight of the papers felt heavier than their physical mass, burdened with the responsibility of seeking justice for crimes that had gone unpunished for decades. We'll need to be careful about who we trust, he said. If this network is as extensive as you suggest, we can't assume anyone in law enforcement is clean. Trust no one completely until we know their connections to Marcus. Assume everyone is compromised until proven otherwise. That includes my own superiors, especially your superiors. Nathan mounted his horse, watching as Evangeline settled gracefully onto her Arabian mare. The handcuffs remained in his saddlebags, a symbol of the traditional law enforcement approach they were abandoning in favor of something more complex and dangerous. One more question, Nathan said as they prepared to ride toward Dallas. What happens after we bring down the network? What happens to us? Evangeline considered the question seriously. I don't know. I've spent so many years focused on survival that I've never planned beyond the immediate threat. And now I'm learning what it feels like to have a future worth planning for. They rode north toward Dallas through country that had been shaped by violence and corruption, following roads that Marcus Blackwood had helped build with stolen money and forced labor. Behind them lay the ranch where 12 men had died seeking fortune and found only justice. Ahead lay a city where powerful men continued to profit from crimes that most people couldn't imagine. Nathan found himself studying his new partner as they traveled, noting how she sat her horse with unconscious authority, how her eyes constantly surveyed their surroundings for potential threats. Evangeline Blackwood remained a killer, a woman who had taken 12 lives without apparent remorse. But she was also a survivor who had transformed herself repeatedly to meet impossible circumstances. And now she was transforming herself again into something neither of them could fully predict. The partnership they had forged beside the creek would either bring justice to a corrupt system or destroy them both in the attempt. Nathan suspected that Evangeline was prepared for either outcome, and he found himself hoping he possessed the same courage. When the time came to face the consequences of their choices, as the sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, they rode toward Dallas and a confrontation with Charles Pemberton that would determine whether justice was possible in a world built on corruption, or whether some crimes were too deeply embedded in the system to ever be fully exposed. Dallas sprawled before them like a fever dream of progress and corruption, where gleaming railroad tracks intersected with muddy streets, and mansions built from stolen wealth cast shadows over shantytowns housing the displaced victims of that theft. The city had grown fat on cattle money and railroad investments, much of it flowing through channels that Marcus Blackwood had helped establish. Charles Pemberton's office occupied the top floor of the Dallas and Western Railroad building, a monument to the transportation empire that connected Texas ranches to eastern markets. Nathan and Evangeline climbed 4 flights of marble stairs, past oil paintings depicting the conquest of the frontier and bronze sculptures celebrating the triumph of civilization over wilderness. The secretary who guarded Pemberton's inner sanctum was a thin man with nervous eyes who clearly recognized Evangeline despite her travel-worn appearance. His stammered greeting confirmed what Nathan had suspected. The Blackwood name still carried weight in Dallas business circles, even 3 months after Marcus's death. "Mrs. Blackwood, what an unexpected pleasure. Mr. Pemberton is in meetings all afternoon, but I'm sure he could spare a few minutes for you." "We'll wait," Evangeline said with the calm authority of someone accustomed to having her wishes accommodated. "Please let Mr. Pemberton know that I've brought Marshal Colt to discuss some business matters that require his immediate attention." The secretary scurried into the inner office, and within moments, Charles Pemberton emerged with the forced smile of a man who had just received unwelcome news. He was shorter than Nathan had expected, with the soft build of someone who had spent more time behind desks than in saddles. His clothes were expensive but conservative, chosen to project respectability rather than ostentation. "Evangeline, my dear, you look well. And Marshal Colt, welcome to Dallas." Pemberton's greeting carried the practiced warmth of a politician, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "We need to discuss Thomas Brennan's investigation," Evangeline said without preamble. Color drained from Pemberton's face like water from a broken dam. His practiced smile faltered, revealing the fear that lurked beneath his civilized veneer. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Who is Thomas Brennan?" "The Texas Ranger who spent 6 months documenting your criminal activities before I killed him," Evangeline replied with shocking directness. "The man whose evidence is currently in Marshal Colt's possession." Pemberton glanced around his reception area, noting the presence of his secretary and several clerks within earshot. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my private office." The inner sanctum reflected Pemberton's position in Dallas society. Maps of railroad routes covered the walls, marking the expansion of his transportation empire across the Southwest. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with contracts, correspondence, and financial documents that represented millions of dollars in ongoing business. "Close the door," Pemberton instructed his secretary. "Hold all appointments for the next hour." When they were alone, Pemberton's facade crumbled completely. He moved to a window overlooking the bustling streets of Dallas, his hands shaking as he gripped the sill. "How much do you know?" he asked without turning around. Nathan opened his saddlebag and withdrew a selection of Thomas's documents. "We know about the cattle rustling operation. We know about the bribes to federal judges. We know about the land fraud schemes that displaced homesteader families. We know about the murders," Evangeline added quietly. Pemberton turned from the window, his face aged 10 years in as many minutes. "What do you want?" "Complete cooperation in dismantling the network," Nathan said. "Names, locations, financial records, operational details. Everything you know about how Marcus's organization functioned." "In exchange for what?" "Reduced charges. Protection for your family. A chance to make restitution to the people you've harmed." Pemberton laughed bitterly. "You think I have a choice in this matter?" "Everyone has choices," Nathan replied. "The question is whether you're smart enough to make the right one. If I cooperate, I'm a dead man. William Hartley and Pete Garrison won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their operations. If you don't cooperate, you're still a dead man. The only difference is whether you die as a criminal or as someone who tried to make amends." Pemberton moved to his desk, settling heavily into a leather chair that had cost more than most families. earned in a year. His empire, built on transportation contracts and political corruption, suddenly felt as fragile as smoke in a strong wind. "Rebecca doesn't know," he said finally. "My daughter has never suspected that her education, her social position, her engagement to Judge Morrison's son, all of it was paid for with blood money." "She doesn't have to know," Evangeline said. "Cooperation protects innocent family members." "What kind of cooperation?" Nathan spread several documents across Pemberton's desk, watching the railroad executive's expression change as he recognized his own correspondence with Marcus. "We need operational details. How the stolen cattle were laundered through legitimate sales, how the bribes were paid and recorded, how decisions were made about which homesteaders to target." "You're asking me to destroy myself." "We're asking you to choose between destroying yourself and being destroyed by others," Evangeline corrected. "William Hartley and Pete Garrison will sacrifice you the moment they feel threatened. Cooperation gives you some control over your fate." Pemberton studied the evidence spread before him, recognizing not just his own crimes, but the careful documentation that would make conviction inevitable. Thomas Brennan had been thorough in ways that exceeded professional obligation, driven by personal conviction that had ultimately cost him his life. "Thomas Brennan was a good man," Pemberton said unexpectedly. "Yes, he was," Nathan agreed. "I tried to warn him off, sent word through intermediaries that his investigation was becoming dangerous, that he should abandon the case before someone got hurt. But he didn't listen. Rangers don't abandon cases because criminals find them inconvenient." Pemberton's voice carried grudging respect. "Thomas Brennan was the kind of lawman that Marcus always feared would eventually come after us. Instead, you got me," Nathan observed. "Instead, we got you and her working together." Pemberton glanced at Evangeline with something approaching admiration. "I underestimated you, my dear. We all did. Men usually do." Pemberton opened his desk drawer and withdrew a leather portfolio filled with additional documents. Financial records, shipping, manifests, correspondence with criminal associates in other states. The scope of the evidence suggested that Marcus's network had operated on a scale that dwarfed anything Nathan had imagined. "This represents 23 years of criminal activity," Pemberton said, placing the portfolio on his desk. "Every major cattle theft, every fraudulent land deal, every bribe and murder and active intimidation. Marcus kept meticulous records because he enjoyed documenting his own success." Nathan examined the new documents, his amazement growing with each page. The network hadn't simply stolen cattle or defrauded homesteaders. It had systematically corrupted every institution designed to protect honest citizens from criminal predation. How? Many people knew the full scope of the operation. 4 of us in the inner circle. Marcus, myself, William Hartley, and Pete Garrison. Below us were dozens of associates, ranch hands, clerks, and enforcers who knew pieces of the whole, but never saw the complete picture. And now that Marcus is dead, Hartley assumed overall leadership. Garrison handles enforcement and intimidation. I manage the financial aspects and transportation logistics. Evangeline leaned forward, studying Pemberton with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "What about the succession plan?" Marcus was too careful not to have prepared for his own death. Pemberton's expression grew even more troubled. "Marcus assumed you would remarry quickly, that your new husband would take control of the ranch and continue the operation. He never anticipated that you would eliminate potential successors or that you possess the intelligence to run things independently. So his death disrupted more than just the leadership structure. His death created a power vacuum that we're still trying to fill. The operation is running on momentum and existing contracts, but we've lost the strategic vision that Marcus provided." Nathan recognized opportunity in Pemberton's words. A criminal network in disarray was more vulnerable to investigation and prosecution than one operating at full efficiency. Internal conflicts and power struggles would create chances to turn associates against each other. Who else knows about Thomas's investigation? Hartley and Garrison know that someone was asking dangerous questions. They don't know how much evidence Thomas gathered or where it's hidden. Do they know he's dead? They know 12 men died trying to marry Evangeline. They assumed Thomas was simply another fortune hunter who met an unfortunate end. Nathan and Evangeline exchanged glances, recognizing that Thomas's true identity remained secret from his intended targets. The criminal network had eliminated their greatest threat without realizing what they had accomplished, giving Nathan and Evangeline an advantage that careful planning could exploit. "We need more than your cooperation," Nathan said. "We need you to actively work against your former associates." How? By feeding them false information. By convincing them that the threat has passed. By keeping them complacent while we build cases against them. Pemberton stood and walked to a safe hidden behind a landscape painting. Inside were additional documents, cash reserves, and correspondence that painted an even more detailed picture of the network's operations. "If I do this, if I betray William and Pete, what guarantee do I have that you'll protect my daughter?" "My word as a federal marshal," Nathan said. "Rebecca will be kept out of this entirely. And what guarantee do I have that you'll keep your word?" Nathan considered the question seriously. Pemberton was asking him to make promises about events beyond his control, to guarantee outcomes in a situation where powerful enemies would stop at nothing to protect themselves. "None," Nathan said finally. "But you have my commitment to try. Which is more than you'll get from Hartley and Garrison when they decide you've become a liability." Pemberton returned to his desk, staring at the evidence that documented decades of criminal activity. His empire, built on corruption and violence, had provided wealth and social position for his family. Destroying it would cost him everything he had worked to achieve, but preserving it would ultimately cost him everything he truly valued. "There's something else you should know," he said finally, "about why Marcus really married Evangeline." Nathan felt Evangeline stiffen beside him. "What do you mean?" "Marcus didn't choose her randomly. He didn't marry her simply because she was young and beautiful and available." Pemberton met Evangeline's gaze directly. "He married her because he knew what she was capable of." "I don't understand." "Evangeline's father wasn't just a failed cotton farmer. He was a Confederate operative during the war, responsible for organizing guerrilla attacks against Union supply lines. He taught his daughter things that most women never learn: how to plan, how to fight, how to kill when necessary." The revelation struck Nathan like lightning. Evangeline's capacity for violence, her strategic thinking, her ability to manipulate dangerous situations, none of it had been learned during her marriage to Marcus. It had been part of her character long before she set foot on Blackwood Ranch. "Marcus knew?" Nathan asked. "Marcus chose her specifically because he recognized a kindred spirit. Someone who understood that survival sometimes requires terrible choices." Nathan turned to Evangeline, searching her face for confirmation or denial. Instead, he found only the same calm acceptance she had shown throughout their journey together. "Is it true?" he asked. "My father was many things, Marshal. A farmer was the least of them." The admission reframed everything Nathan thought he understood about Evangeline's transformation from innocent bride to calculating killer. She hadn't been corrupted by her marriage to Marcus. She had been selected for that marriage precisely because corruption was unnecessary. "You've been playing a role for 11 years, Nathan said with a dawning understanding. "I've been surviving for 11 years. The role was just the method I chose." Pemberton watched this exchange with growing recognition that the dynamic between Nathan and Evangeline was more complex than simple law enforcement partnership. The marshal was falling under the spell of a woman who had been trained from childhood to be dangerous, and that attraction could compromise the very justice they sought to achieve. "Be careful, Marshal," Pemberton warned. Marcus thought he could control her too. Nathan met Pemberton's gaze steadily. "I'm not trying to control her. I'm trying to work with her. The difference might not matter in the end." As afternoon shadows lengthened across Dallas, the three of them continued planning their assault on a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades. But Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap of his own making, drawn by a woman whose true nature remained as mysterious as the Texas horizon that had shaped them both. The telegram arrived at the Dallas and Western Railroad office at precisely 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon. Its message brief and devastating. "Federal marshals en route Dallas. Pemberton compromised. Eliminate immediately. W.H." Charles Pemberton's hands trembled as he read the words that confirmed his worst fears. William Hartley had discovered his cooperation with Nathan Colt and Evangeline Blackwood, and the judge's response was characteristically direct. Pemberton had perhaps 6 hours before Hartley's enforcers arrived to silence him permanently. Nathan studied the telegram over Pemberton's shoulder, noting the careful phrasing that avoided explicit threats while conveying unmistakable intent. Judge Hartley had spent decades perfecting the art of communicating violence through seemingly innocent language, a skill that had kept him safe from prosecution, even as his orders resulted in dozens of deaths. "How did he find out?" Nathan asked. "Hartley has sources everywhere," Pemberton replied, his voice hollow with resignation. "Telegraph operators, hotel clerks, bank employees. He probably knew you were in Dallas within hours of your arrival." Evangeline moved to the window overlooking the bustling street 4 stories below. Her eyes tracked the movement of pedestrians and carriages with the automatic vigilance of someone who had learned to spot threats before they became deadly. "3 men just entered the building," she reported. "They're not here for railroad business." Nathan joined her at the window, observing the figures who moved through the crowd with purposeful efficiency. Professional killers possessed a distinctive quality of movement, a focus that separated them from ordinary citizens going about their daily business. "How long do we have?" Pemberton asked. "Minutes, not hours," Nathan replied, his mind racing through tactical options. The office building offered limited escape routes, and Hartley's men would have positioned themselves to control the most obvious exits. "There's a service stairway," Pemberton said, moving toward a door concealed behind a bookshelf. "It leads to the loading dock behind the building." "They'll have that covered too," Evangeline observed. "Professional killers don't leave escape routes unguarded." Nathan evaluated their situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 8 years of frontier law enforcement. 3 armed men in a building with controlled exits, innocent civilians in the line of fire, and a target who possessed information crucial to their investigation. The tactical disadvantages were overwhelming. "We fight our way out," he decided. Against 3 professional gunmen in a crowded building? Pemberton's voice cracked with fear. "That's suicide." "Surrender is suicide," Evangeline corrected. "Fighting gives us a chance." Nathan checked his weapons, a Colt .45 revolver and a Winchester rifle that had served him faithfully through countless confrontations. 6 shots in the pistol, 15 in the rifle, against an unknown number of enemies with superior positioning. The mathematics of survival looked grim. "Charles, do you have any weapons?" Pemberton opened another desk drawer, revealing a nickel-plated Derringer that looked more decorative than functional. "I'm not a fighting man, Marshal. Today you are." The sound of footsteps in the outer office announced that Hartley's men had reached the 4th floor. Nathan positioned himself beside the door, rifle ready, while Evangeline took cover behind Pemberton's massive desk. The railroad executive crouched in the corner, clutching his Derringer like a talisman against the violence that was about to erupt. "Mr. Pemberton," a voice called from beyond the door. "We need to speak with you about some urgent business matters." "I'm in a meeting," Pemberton called back, his voice surprisingly steady. "You'll need to schedule an appointment." I'm afraid this can't wait. The door handle turned slowly, and Nathan found himself facing three men whose reputations had preceded them across half the frontier. Jack Donovan, known for his skill with a knife and his complete lack of conscience. Pete Sullivan, whose accuracy with a rifle had earned him employment from cattle barons who needed problems solved quietly. And leading them, Vincent Carver, whose name was whispered in saloons from Kansas to Mexico as synonymous with sudden death. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Nathan said conversationally. "I'm afraid Mr. Pemberton is unavailable for the kind of business you're offering." Carver's eyes flicked around the office, noting positions and calculating angles with professional efficiency. "Deputy Marshal Colt, I presume. Judge Hartley sends his regrets about this unfortunate situation. No situation here that can't be resolved peacefully." "I'm afraid there is." Carver's hand moved slowly toward his gun. "You see, Mr. Pemberton has been sharing information he shouldn't share with people he shouldn't trust. That creates problems that require permanent solutions." Nathan understood that negotiation was futile. Hartley's orders had been explicit, and men like Carver didn't deviate from their instructions regardless of circumstances. The only question was whether the coming violence would accomplish anything beyond adding more bodies to the growing toll. "Before this gets ugly," Nathan said, "you should know that we've already transmitted copies of Pemberton's evidence to federal authorities in Washington. Killing us won't stop the investigation." Carver smiled with genuine amusement. "Marshal, if we killed everyone who claimed to have insurance policies against their own deaths, we'd depopulate half of Texas. Judge Hartley didn't build his organization by being intimidated by empty threats." "What makes you think the threats are empty?" "Because you're still here instead of riding hard for the nearest federal outpost. Because you're trying to negotiate instead of shooting. Because you're betting that we won't risk a gunfight in a crowded building." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Nathan had hoped to avoid violence that could endanger innocent civilians, but that restraint was being interpreted as weakness by men who recognized only force as legitimate currency. "Your move, Marshal," Carver said, his hand now resting openly on his pistol grip. Nathan's response came in the form of overturned furniture as he dove sideways, rifle blazing. His first shot took Donovan in the chest before the man could clear leather. His second shattered the window behind Carver's head, sending glass cascading onto the street below. Evangeline moved with fluid grace that spoke to training Nathan was only beginning to understand. She vaulted over Pemberton's desk, snatched a letter opener from its mahogany stand, and buried the blade in Sullivan's neck before he could bring his rifle to bear. The gunman dropped without firing a shot, blood pooling across imported carpet that had cost more than most families earned in a year. Carver found himself facing two opponents whose coordination suggested experience working together, though Nathan and Evangeline had never fought side by side before that moment. The killer's professional confidence wavered as he realized that the easy assassination he had expected was becoming a pitched battle against adversaries who refused to die quietly. "Pemberton," Carver snarled, "you've made a serious mistake." "Charles has made the first smart decision of his adult life," Evangeline replied, retrieving Sullivan's rifle and checking its ammunition. "The question is whether you're smart enough to surrender before this situation gets worse for everyone involved." "I don't surrender to women." "Then you die to one." Carver's draw was fast enough to justify his reputation, but Nathan's was faster. The marshal's bullet caught the killer's center mass, spinning him around to crash into the bookshelf that concealed the service stairway. Books tumbled across the floor, their pages scattering like fallen leaves as Vincent Carver breathed his last. The gunfight had lasted less than 30 seconds, but its aftermath would reshape everything that followed. Nathan reloaded his weapons while Evangeline searched the bodies for additional intelligence. Pemberton emerged from his corner, staring at the carnage with the shocked expression of someone who had witnessed violence up close for the first time. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered. This is what your business partnership really looked like, Evangeline said bluntly. This is how problems were solved when Marcus ran the network. Nathan found documents in Carver's coat that confirmed the scope of Hartley's current operations. The judge wasn't simply maintaining Marcus's criminal enterprise. He was expanding it, using his judicial position to eliminate competitors and acquire their assets through legal theft. "We need to move," Nathan said. "More killers will come once." Hartley realizes these three failed. "Where can we go that's safe?" Pemberton asked. "Nowhere in Texas," Evangeline replied. "Hartley's influence extends into every county, every courthouse, every sheriff's office. Then we go outside Texas." Nathan studied a map of railroad routes spread across Pemberton's desk, tracing lines that connected Dallas to cities beyond Hartley's immediate reach. The investigation they were pursuing would require resources and legal authority that existed only at the federal level, away from local corruption. Colorado territory, Nathan decided. Federal courthouse in Denver, outside Hartley's jurisdiction. Judge Morrison there has a reputation for integrity. "That's Rebecca's fiance's father," Pemberton said with growing alarm. "If this scandal touches his family, if we don't stop Hartley, the scandal will eventually destroy everyone connected to this network," Evangeline pointed out, "including your daughter." Pemberton gathered essential documents while Nathan and Evangeline collected weapons and ammunition from the dead killers. The office that had represented Charles Pemberton's legitimate business interests was now a crime scene that would bring unwanted attention from local authorities. "What about my business?" Pemberton asked. "My employees, my contracts, my reputation?" "Your business was built on blood money," Nathan replied. "Your employees will find other work. Your contracts can be transferred or dissolved. Your reputation was purchased with other people's suffering." "And my family?" "Your family will survive if you help us bring down the people who would destroy them to protect themselves." They made their way down the service stairway, moving carefully through a building that might contain additional threats. Nathan led with his rifle ready, while Evangeline covered their rear with Sullivan's weapon. Pemberton followed between them, clutching a portfolio containing evidence that could topple governments if used properly. The loading dock opened onto an alley that reeked of horse manure and rotting garbage, where delivery wagons waited to transport goods throughout the city. Nathan commandeered a freight wagon while Evangeline helped Pemberton load essential documents, transforming themselves from office visitors into cargo handlers in a matter of minutes. "Drive naturally," Nathan instructed as they emerged onto the main street. "We're just another delivery wagon making afternoon rounds." Dallas flowed around them with the chaotic energy of a city caught between frontier past and industrial future. Cowboys fresh from cattle drives mingled with railroad executives in tailored suits, while vendors hawked everything from patent medicines to stolen jewelry to anyone with money to spend. "Where are we really going?" Evangeline asked once they had cleared the business district. "Fort Worth first, then Denver," Nathan replied. "But we're not traveling together." "What do you mean?" "Three people traveling together will be easy to track. We split up, take different routes, meet in Denver at a prearranged location." Pemberton looked alarmed. "You're abandoning me?" "I'm protecting you. Hartley's men will focus on tracking me and Evangeline. You'll be safer traveling alone, using railroad connections to reach Denver quickly and quietly." "What if I decide to run instead? What if I disappear with the evidence and leave you both to face Hartley alone?" Nathan brought the wagon to a stop beside a freight depot where trains arrived and departed with mechanical regularity. "Then you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when Hartley's killers will finally catch up with you. Your daughter will never be safe as long as you're alive to threaten the network. And if I cooperate? Then we bring down everyone who's been profiting from Marcus's crimes, and your daughter gets to marry into a respectable family without carrying the weight of your sins." Pemberton climbed down from the wagon, portfolio clutched against his chest like armor against an uncertain future. "How will I find you in Denver?" "The Federal Building, every day at noon until we arrive," Nathan said. "If we don't show up within 2 weeks, assume we're dead and take the evidence to Judge Morrison yourself. And if I'm dead, then we pursue justice without your cooperation." Evangeline watched Pemberton disappear into the crowded depot, another player in a game whose rules were changing faster than anyone could follow. The railroad executive represented both their greatest asset and their most dangerous vulnerability. A man whose cooperation could expose decades of corruption, but whose betrayal could destroy them all. "Do you trust him?" Nathan asked. "I trust his fear. Men like Charles Pemberton don't possess the courage to be heroes, but they're terrified enough of consequences to be useful allies." Nathan guided their wagon toward the western edge of Dallas, where the city's influence faded into open country that offered both freedom and exposure. Their journey to Denver would take them through territory controlled by men who had every reason to want them dead, but it would also take them beyond the immediate reach of Judge Hartley's local authority. "Tell me about your father," Nathan said as Dallas fell away behind them. "What do you want to know?" "How a cotton farmer became a Confederate operative. How he trained his daughter to be a killer." Evangeline was quiet for so long that Nathan thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried memories that had been buried beneath years of careful performance. "My father wasn't a farmer by choice. He was a soldier by nature who was forced into agriculture by circumstances beyond his control. When the war came, he finally found a purpose that matched his abilities. And he involved you in that purpose. He taught me that survival sometimes requires violence, that weakness invites exploitation, that the world respects only strength and cunning." Evangeline's hands moved automatically to guide the horses, her attention split between conversation and the road ahead. "He also taught me that intelligent women hide their intelligence, that dangerous women hide their danger, that survival often depends on allowing others to underestimate your capabilities. Is that what you've been doing? Hiding your true capabilities? Until now." Nathan felt the weight of that admission. Evangeline had spent years concealing her intelligence and training beneath the mask of dutiful wife, but their partnership was allowing her to reveal abilities that had been carefully hidden since childhood. "What else did your father teach you?" "That justice and law aren't the same thing. That sometimes good people have to do terrible things to stop worse people from doing worse things." Evangeline turned to study Nathan's profile as he drove. "He also taught me to recognize men who understand the difference between legal and right. And you think I understand that difference? You arrested me for murder, then offered partnership instead of prosecution. You're risking your career and your life to pursue justice that goes beyond simple law enforcement." Evangeline's voice softened slightly. "Yes, Marshal. I think you understand that difference very well." The road to Fort Worth stretched before them like a ribbon of possibility and danger, leading through a country where Marcus Blackwood's influence had shaped every settlement, every ranch, every business relationship. They would be traveling through territory where their enemies held every advantage except the element of surprise. "We need to discuss what happens in Denver," Nathan said. "What do you mean?" "I mean what happens between us. What our partnership becomes once we've exposed the network and brought down the criminals." Evangeline considered the question seriously. "I don't know. I've spent so many years focused on survival that I've never planned beyond the immediate threat. And now I'm discovering what it feels like to have someone see me clearly and choose partnership instead of condemnation." Nathan felt the dangerous pull of attraction that had been building since their first conversation on the Blackwood ranch porch. Evangeline Blackwood was a killer, a woman who had taken 12 lives without apparent remorse. But she was also intelligent, brave, and shaped by circumstances that would have destroyed someone weaker. "You realize that even if we succeed, even if we bring down Hartley and his associates, You'll still face charges for the men you killed, I know. And you realize that any relationship between us would be complicated by the fact that I'm the lawman who arrested you. I know that too. Then what are you hoping for? Evangeline was quiet for several minutes, watching the Texas landscape roll past in waves of gold and brown grass. When she finally answered, her voice carried a vulnerability that Nathan hadn't heard before. I'm hoping that somewhere between arrest and trial, between partnership and justice, we might find something that resembles a future worth having. The admission hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and impossible to grasp directly. Nathan understood that Evangeline was offering him more than cooperation in their investigation. She was offering the possibility of transformation, of becoming something neither of them had been before their paths crossed. That's a dangerous hope. All the best hopes are dangerous. They reached Fort Worth as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Nathan of blood and fire. The city bustled with the controlled chaos of a major cattle shipping center, where cowboys fresh from long drives mingled with businessmen closing deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nathan guided their wagon to a modest hotel near the stockyards, choosing accommodation that would attract minimal attention from the kind of people who tracked dangerous fugitives for money. The desk clerk barely glanced up from his ledger as they registered under false names, payment in cash, ensuring that no questions would be asked about their business in Fort Worth. Their room overlooked the cattle pens, where thousands of longhorns waited for transport to eastern markets. The animals moved restlessly in the confined spaces, their lowing creating a constant background chorus that spoke to freedoms lost and destinations unknown. Tomorrow we catch the morning train to Denver, Nathan said, studying a railroad schedule he had purchased from the station agent. 18 hours if the connections work properly. And if Hartley's men are waiting at the station? Then we fight our way onto the train and hope we can stay alive long enough to reach federal territory. Evangeline moved to the window, watching the sunset paint the cattle pens in golden light. There's something else we need to discuss before we reach Denver. What? What we're going to tell the federal authorities about my crimes. What story we're going to present that makes cooperation more attractive than prosecution. Nathan had been avoiding this question since their partnership began, but he could no longer postpone the reckoning that awaited them in Colorado. Evangeline had committed 12 murders, regardless of her motives or the character of her victims. Federal prosecutors wouldn't ignore such crimes, even in exchange for evidence against a larger conspiracy. We tell them the truth, that you were forced into an impossible situation and responded with violence that served a larger justice. Will they believe that? Some will, others won't. But the evidence we're carrying will make your cooperation too valuable to ignore, until the evidence is no longer needed. Nathan turned from the window to face her directly. What are you saying? I'm saying that once the federal authorities have what they need to prosecute Hartley and his associates, my value as a witness will disappear. And when that happens, I'll become just another murderer awaiting execution. The logic was unassailable. Evangeline's cooperation would be essential during the investigation and trial phases, but once convictions were secured, her own crimes would demand justice. The federal system that Nathan served was designed to punish lawbreakers regardless of their motivations or the larger good their actions might have served. There might be alternatives, such as witness protection, a new identity, a chance to start over somewhere far from Texas and the men who shaped you into what you became. Evangeline considered this possibility with the same analytical detachment she applied to all strategic decisions. Running away from consequences isn't the same as escaping them. No, but it's survival. And you've proven remarkably good at survival. I've proven good at adapting to circumstances beyond my control, but adaptation isn't the same as choosing your own fate. Nathan found himself in the uncomfortable position of advocating for options that felt like compromises with justice. Evangeline deserved punishment for her crimes, but she also deserved recognition for the impossible circumstances that had driven her to violence. What do you want, Evangeline? What outcome would feel like justice to you? I want the men who corrupted this territory to face consequences for their actions. I want the families they destroyed to receive compensation for their suffering. I want the institutions they perverted to be cleansed and restored. And for yourself? For myself, I want to know that my actions mattered for something beyond my own survival. Nathan realized that Evangeline was asking for the chance to transform her crimes into something meaningful, to ensure that her violence served justice, rather than simply perpetuating the cycle of corruption that had shaped her life. We can make that happen, he said. Can we? Or are we just telling ourselves comfortable lies about uncomfortable truths? The question haunted Nathan as night settled over Fort Worth like a shroud. Outside their window, the cattle continued their restless movement, sensing the approach of morning and the journey to unknown destinations. Inside the room, a marshal and a murderer planned their assault on a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades. Nathan found himself hoping that justice and law might finally align in the federal courthouse in Denver, but he also understood that hope was a luxury that people in their situation couldn't afford. Whatever happened in Colorado would determine not just their fates, but the fate of everyone who had suffered under Marcus Blackwood's legacy of violence and corruption. As Evangeline settled into the room's single chair, Nathan realized that somewhere between arrest and partnership, between condemnation and understanding, he had begun to care more about her survival than about strict adherence to legal procedure. The transformation troubled him, but it also offered the possibility of a justice more complex and meaningful than anything he had pursued before. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow we find out whether federal justice is different from frontier justice. And if it isn't, then we create our own. Judge Harrison Morrison's courthouse in Denver stood like a monument to federal justice, its granite columns and marble floors representing law that existed beyond local corruption. Nathan and Evangeline climbed the steps together, no longer marshal and prisoner but partners, carrying evidence that would reshape criminal prosecution across the Southwest. Charles Pemberton waited in the lobby, his face gaunt from 2 weeks of sleepless nights and constant fear. Beside him sat a distinguished woman in her 50s whose resemblance to Pemberton marked her clearly as family. Rebecca, Pemberton said, rising as they approached. I'd like you to meet Marshal Colt and Mrs. Blackwood. Rebecca Pemberton possessed her father's intelligent eyes but none of his nervous energy. She studied Evangeline with frank curiosity, apparently unaware that she was meeting the woman responsible for 12 deaths in Texas. Father has told me you're working together to expose some terrible crimes, Rebecca said. I want to thank you for giving him the chance to make things right. Nathan found himself moved by the young woman's trust in her father's redemption. She had accepted Charles's transformation from railroad executive to federal witness without demanding explanations that would have shattered her understanding of their family's wealth. Your father is showing considerable courage, Nathan replied. Courage runs in our family, Rebecca said with a smile that reminded Nathan painfully of his sister Sarah, though it sometimes takes us time to find it. Judge Morrison emerged from his chambers precisely at noon, a man whose reputation for integrity had survived 30 years of frontier justice. He was tall and austere, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Nathan had appeared before Morrison's court twice during his career, both times impressed by the judge's commitment to legal principles over political expedience. Marshal Colt, Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Pemberton, Morrison said formally. I understand you have evidence of criminal conspiracy spanning multiple states. We do, Your Honor, Nathan replied. Evidence that documents decades of murder, theft, and corruption involving federal judges, county sheriffs, and railroad executives. Morrison's expression grew grave. These are serious accusations requiring extraordinary proof. Nathan opened Thomas Brennan's portfolio, spreading documents across the judge's desk with the reverence due to sacred relics. Morrison examined each piece of evidence carefully, his frown deepening as he grasped the scope of the criminal network that had operated beneath his jurisdiction. "Remarkable documentation," Morrison said finally. "Ranger Brennan was thorough in ways that exceed professional obligation. Thomas died seeking justice for crimes that others preferred to ignore," Evangeline said quietly. "And you killed him." "For it. I killed him to protect innocent people who would have been destroyed by premature exposure of this network." Morrison studied Evangeline with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated countless criminals during his judicial career. "You're asking me to weigh 12 murders against the larger good served by preserving this investigation. I'm asking you to recognize that justice sometimes requires terrible choices." The judge returned to Thomas's evidence, reading correspondence between Marcus Blackwood and Judge William Hartley that documented the purchase of legal decisions over a span of decades. The casual nature of the corruption, the matter-of-fact way powerful men discuss destroying lives for profit, spoke to institutional failure on a scale that exceeded individual criminal activity. "Mr. Pemberton," Morrison said, "are you prepared to testify against your former associates?" "I am, Your Honor, whatever the consequences to myself." "Mrs. Blackwood, are you prepared to face trial for the murders you've committed?" "I am, Your Honor, with the understanding that my trial will expose the corruption that created the circumstances leading to those deaths." Morrison closed the portfolio, his decision made. "Marshal Colt, I'm authorizing you to pursue a federal investigation into this conspiracy. Mrs. Blackwood, you'll remain in federal custody as a material witness until this matter is resolved." "And then?" Evangeline asked. "Then we determine whether justice requires punishment or whether it's already been served." 6 months later, the trials that resulted from Thomas Brennan's investigation reshaped criminal law across the frontier. Judge William Hartley was convicted of corruption and conspiracy, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Sheriff Pete Garrison faced similar charges in a different venue. Dozens of associates received lesser sentences after cooperating with federal prosecutors. Evangeline's trial became a sensation that drew reporters from across the country. Her defense, led by attorneys provided by the federal government, argued that her actions constituted justifiable resistance to systematic oppression. The prosecution countered that murder was murder regardless of circumstances. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict that satisfied no one completely, guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, with sentence suspended in recognition of extraordinary circumstances and valuable cooperation with federal authorities. Nathan testified on her behalf, describing her intelligence, her courage, her commitment to justice that transcended personal survival. His testimony crossed professional boundaries in ways that raised eyebrows among federal prosecutors, but it also provided crucial context for understanding her actions. On a spring morning in 1888, Evangeline Blackwood walked out of the federal courthouse in Denver, a free woman. Nathan waited on the steps, no longer her captor, but not yet something more, uncertain about what their partnership would become in a world where law enforcement and personal attraction intersected in unprecedented ways. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we find out what we become when we're not fighting for survival." They returned to Texas together, to a ranch that had been transformed by federal oversight and new management. Thunder grazed peacefully in pastures that had been purchased with blood money but were now being used to raise cattle through legitimate means. The stallion had been retrained by experts who understood that even dangerous animals could be reformed given proper guidance and patience. Nathan resigned his position as deputy marshal and accepted Evangeline's offer to help manage the ranch that had been the center of so much violence and corruption. Their partnership evolved slowly from professional cooperation into something deeper, built on shared understanding of difficult choices and mutual respect for each other's complexities. They married on the anniversary of Thomas Brennan's death. In a ceremony attended by his sister Sarah and dozens of families who had received compensation from Marcus Blackwood's estate. The wedding represented not just personal happiness, but symbolic justice. The transformation of a place associated with death into one celebrating life and second chances. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony, noting in his remarks that justice sometimes took unexpected forms, that redemption was possible even for those who had committed terrible acts in service of larger truths. Years later, when reporters asked Evangeline about the 12 men who had died seeking her hand in marriage, she would answer with the honesty that had characterized her partnership with Nathan from the beginning. They came seeking fortune and found justice instead. Their deaths served a purpose beyond their intentions, exposing corruption that would have continued destroying innocent lives indefinitely. And when those same reporters asked Nathan about falling in love with a confessed killer, he would reply, with equal directness, "I learned that understanding someone's crimes isn't the same as excusing them, but it's the beginning of justice that goes beyond simple punishment." The Blackwood Ranch prospered under their joint management, its profits now serving compensation for Marcus's victims rather than funding new crimes. Thunder lived out his days in peaceful retirement, a symbol of how even the most dangerous creatures could be transformed through patience and proper guidance. In the end, 12 men had died seeking Evangeline's fortune, but the 13th had found something more valuable than wealth. Nathan Colt had discovered that justice sometimes required courage to look beyond law, to see the person shaped by impossible circumstances, and to choose understanding over condemnation. Their love story became legend throughout Texas not because it was romantic in traditional ways, but because it proved that redemption was possible even for those who had committed unforgivable acts in service of larger truths. The ranch where 12 men had died became a place where justice and mercy learned to coexist, where the past sins were transformed into the future's possibilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.